The first remembrance gathering happened in a church hall in Coventry. 31 people, folding chairs arranged in a rough oval, a projector borrowed from the secondary school 2 streets over, and a man named Gerald Price who had driven 4 hours from Edinburgh because he had heard through a chain of letters and forwarded messages that other people existed. People like him, people who still remembered. That was 16 years ago. 3 months after the Vale-Thari Compact signed the Pacification Accord with the remnant governments of Earth's northern hemisphere. The accord had many provisions, most of them dressed in the language of reconstruction and mutual prosperity. But the one that mattered, the one that changed everything, was Article 19. Article 19 declared that the organized tradition of human warfare, its doctrine, its history, its institutional memory, constituted a destabilizing cultural artifact. The Compact's Reconciliation Bureau would oversee the archiving of all military material. Former soldiers would submit to a structured decommissioning program. Military academies would be repurposed as administrative colleges. The clause used the phrase compassionate discontinuation, which was the most frightening pair of words Mara Okafor had ever read in a legal document. She had been a xenoarchaeologist at the University of Manchester when the Compact arrived. She had spent 6 years studying the Vale-Thari's own abandoned orbital installations in the outer belt, learning their language, their material culture, the way they marked time and organized space, the particular architecture of their thought. She understood them better than almost anyone on Earth, which was why she had been seconded to the negotiation teams, and why she had been in the room when Article 19 was read aloud, and why she had watched 11 government ministers sign it without blinking. She had known in that moment that someone needed to be very careful. The church hall in Coventry belonged to a congregation that no longer met on Sundays. The minister had emigrated to the reclaimed zones in the south, and the building had been turned over to a community trust. A retired sergeant named Dennis Walcott had arranged the booking under the name of a Ramblers Association. The 31 people who showed up had come through a network of coded postal invitations, each one handwritten, none of them stating anything a compact cultural monitor could flag. They sat in the oval of folding chairs, and Gerald Price stood up and said, in a voice that was trying very hard not to shake, "Right, I'll start. I served in the 4th Armored Brigade. I'd like to tell you about the Battle of the Otranto Strait." Nobody stopped him. Nobody told him the Battle of the Otranto Strait was a destabilizing cultural artifact. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, and outside the rain came down on the empty street, and Gerald Price talked for 40 minutes about terrain and weather conditions and the particular calculus of risk that a field commander ran through his head at the moment before committing. He was a compact man in his early 60s with the unhurried hands of someone who had once done difficult things with them and had not forgotten. He spoke without notes. He did not omit the failures. When he finished, a woman named Adeyeze Nanaji said she had been a field surgeon with the 3rd Medical Group, and she wanted to talk about triage under fire, the decisions, the ones you made in seconds that you spent years afterward reconstructing. And nobody stopped her either. And then Dennis Walcott talked about logistics, about the ways an army starved and the ways it didn't, about the specific texture of the problem when the supply chain was 3 days behind your position and it was raining. And then a very young man whose name Mara didn't learn until much later, a man who looked too young to have served, and who had in fact served only 6 months before the accord was signed, talked about what it was like to be trained for something, and then told that the training was now illegal to remember. By the end of the night, they had filled 3 exercise books with notes, not official documents, not records that could be seized under Article 19, just notes, the kind of thing a Ramblers Association might make. Mara drove home through the wet Coventry streets with the windows fogged and her hands steady on the wheel, and she thought, we can do this. We can keep it alive. We can store it in each other and nobody can take it out. She had no idea then how long it would need to stay alive. She also had no idea, not fully, what she was starting. She had thought of it that night as a practical response to a specific threat. The knowledge would be preserved in living memory, in careful notes, in the minds of people who refused to let it be bureaucratically erased. She had not thought yet about the scale of it. She had not thought about what it would become. The Compact established its administrative presence on Earth with what Mara would later describe. In the notes she kept in a journal she hid inside a hollowed-out volume of ecclesiastical history, as the cheerful efficiency of people who have done this many times before. They were not brutal. That was the important thing to understand, the thing that made them so difficult to resist through conventional means. They were not invaders in the old cinematic sense. No death rays, no burning cities, no jackbooted occupation they administered. They processed the decommissioning of armed forces with the same organizational precision they brought to infrastructure projects. Former soldiers received counseling, retraining vouchers, housing credits. Military bases became logistics hubs. The compact's own security apparatus was small, discreet, and very good at finding things it was looking for. But it wasn't looking for Ramblers associations. Mara understood this early. The compact's cultural monitors were oriented toward the spectacular, mass organizing, public agitation, broadcast signals. They were not configured to notice 30 people in a church hall. The Vialthari had pacified 6 species before humanity, and on at least 4 of those worlds, the organized resistance had announced itself through dramatic public gestures within the first decade. The compact had learned to watch for banners. It had not learned to watch for exercise books. She had read, in the years before the Accord, everything available about how the Vialthari processed resistance. The academic literature was limited. The compact did not publish internal assessments, but there were inferences to be drawn from the pattern of events on the worlds where it had occurred. The timing of escalation, the nature of what was suppressed and what was allowed to persist. The compact, she concluded, was an institution that thought in categories. It had a category for military resistance, and a category for cultural dissent, and a category for organized crime, and it was very good at identifying things that fit those categories. What it was not good at was noticing things that didn't fit any category yet. So she built something without a category. She called it the archive, though never in writing. The archive was not an organization. It had no membership rolls, no dues, no formal structure. What it had was a loose constellation of gatherings. The church hall in Coventry became a template and a practice of what Mara privately called living documentation. Every retired soldier, every former intelligence officer, every pilot, logistician, naval commander, military engineer who could be quietly reached and quietly trusted was asked to do one thing: talk. Talk to someone who would remember. Pass it forward. The exercise books multiplied. They were hidden in attics and under floorboards, and inside the false backs of bookshelves, and tucked into the pages of accounting ledgers, and disguised as bird-watching logs and farming records and parish minutes. They were written in a variety of hands, some trained military precision, some the cramped, hurried script of people writing faster than their education had prepared them for, some so small it required a magnifying glass to read. The compact's monitors occasionally swept civilian premises, but they were looking for digital signals and weapons caches, not handwritten notes about artillery targeting protocols dressed up as observations on migratory patterns. The thing Mara came to understand over the first years was that she had not invented this practice. She had formalized it, structured it, given it a loose organizational logic. But the impulse, the refusal to let the knowledge be taken, was already there in every person she approached. Gerald Price had been writing things down since the week after the Accord was signed. Dennis Walcott had a box under his bed before she met him. The field surgeon Adeze Nanaji had filled 2 notebooks in the first month before she knew there was anyone else doing the same thing. They had been waiting, all of them, for someone to organize their stubbornness. Mara's contact in Edinburgh was a former RAF wing commander named Thomas Atkinson, who had spent 20 years flying fast jets and another 5, lecturing at the Air Warfare Center before it was repurposed as a compact administrative college. Atkinson was 63 and had the kind of face that suggested he found most things faintly amusing, including the current situation. He wore his retirement with the ease of a man who understood that the rank had only ever been incidental to the knowledge, and the knowledge couldn't be decommissioned. He ran his gathering out of a fishing club in Leith, 12 members, bi-weekly. He had, over the course of 4 years, recorded from memory a training syllabus for fast jet tactics that ran to 240 pages. He had also assembled, from the memories of 3 former navigators and 2 air traffic controllers who attended his gatherings, a near-complete technical picture of the orbital approach windows around the British Isles. The kind of information that was, under the Accord's provisions, among the most restricted categories of knowledge on the planet. He told Mara this on her 3rd visit, sitting in the back room of the fishing club, with the smell of river water and old engine oil around them, speaking about it the same way he spoke about everything, with the measured precision of someone for whom information had always been the primary instrument. "It's all in here," he said, tapping his temple. "Everything I taught for 5 years. Everything I learned before that. It doesn't go anywhere when they take the computers and the simulators, does it? It's still here." "How long do you think it stays reliable?" Mara asked. "Memory degrades." Acheson considered this seriously. He was not a man who dismissed concerns he found inconvenient. "The concepts stay sharp. The specific numbers drift a bit. That's why we write it down as fast as we can and then we check it against 2 or 3 other people who should know the same numbers. Human memory is inconsistent, but it's also redundant. 3 people who learned the same thing will average out to something close to correct." Mara wrote in her journal that night, "The thing the compact does not understand about humans is that we store information in each other. Not in institutions, not in databases, in each other. A database you can seize, a mind you cannot." She underlined it twice, then added a third line for emphasis. The network grew slowly, and this was by design. By the 3rd year, there were 11 gatherings. By the 5th, 26. By the 7th, the number had reached 38, spread across what remained of Britain, Ireland, and through loose personal connections into the Low Countries and Scandinavia. Not all of them were military in content. Some had evolved to focus on engineering, the industrial and manufacturing knowledge that could be turned to military purposes, but which existed on the right side of Article 19's cultural provisions because it was also the knowledge that kept civilian infrastructure running. Some had evolved to focus on communications and signals work taught by former intelligence professionals who framed their gatherings as amateur radio clubs. The compact became aware of the gatherings in the 7th year, not of their content, not of the archive. They became aware of the gatherings as social events. Small community meetings of veterans and their families, innocuous enough that 2 separate cultural monitor reports in the same quarter described them as a healthy sign of community healing. The compact's senior planetary administrator at the time was an individual named Vekrath 7 of the 3rd Assembly, whom Mara had met twice during the Accord negotiations, and whom she respected despite everything. Because Vekrath was not stupid. Vekrath was thorough, methodical, and genuinely believed in the civilizing mission of the compact. What Vekrath was not, Mara had noted carefully, was imaginative. Vekrath's assessment of the gatherings was that they posed no threat and served a mild therapeutic function. The assessment was filed. The Cultural Monitor Program moved on to monitoring certain digital networks that showed higher levels of agitation. The gatherings continued. Mara filed that information away with satisfaction and a measure of caution. The satisfaction was that she had been right about the compact's categorical thinking. The caution was that she had been right, which meant she needed to keep being right, and being right about an adversary was a thing you could never fully trust, because the adversary also learned. In the 9th year, Mara sat in a converted barn in Shropshire at what was by then the largest gathering the network had hosted, 94 people. Former soldiers from 7 different nations, ranging in age from 31 to 88. A retired general named Adeyemi, who had commanded a multinational peacekeeping force in his last posting and who still held himself like he expected the room to come to attention. A 26-year-old named Callum Rees, who had been 17 when the accord was signed and who had never served a day in uniform but whose grandfather had been at Coventry and who had learned, through 3 years of attending gatherings and listening and writing things down, more about combined arms doctrine than most serving officers had known on the day the accord was signed. The barn smelled of hay and old timber, and the particular human smell of people who have driven long distances and are trying very hard to be quiet about something important. The afternoon light came through the high windows in long dusty shafts and caught the chalk dust from the whiteboard that had been set up at the front, and Mara thought, not for the first time, that there was something almost sacred about the quality of attention in these rooms. Not reverential, it was working attention, practical attention, the attention of people who needed to remember what they were hearing. But it was also the attention of people who knew they were doing something they weren't supposed to do, and found that knowledge clarifying rather than frightening. General Adeyemi stood at the front. They had stopped using the oval of folding chairs some years ago because the gatherings had grown too large and because there was a geometry to teaching that required a front and a back, and he was drawing on the whiteboard with a blue marker, sketching out a defensive perimeter. He was explaining why the shape of the perimeter mattered, why the geometry of fields of fire was not an abstract concept but a physical argument about how violence moved through space. He was doing this in the voice he had used for 30 years when teaching young officers, precise and slightly impatient with imprecision, and the 94 people in the barn were listening with the intensity of people who understood that they were being given something that was trying to be taken away from them. He drew a line. He said, "This is where you think you're safe. This is where you are actually safe." He drew another line, several centimeters away from the first. "The space between those lines is where you die. The distance between them is what good doctrine is for." Mara sat in the third row and watched Callum Reese. He was 26, had never served, and he was writing without looking down at the page, eyes fixed on the whiteboard, hand moving fast across the exercise book in his lap. And she recognized in the quality of his concentration something she had first seen in Gerald Price in the church hall in Coventry and had been watching for ever since. The specific gravity of a person who understood that they were the vessel, and that being a good vessel was the most important thing they could be, right now. Afterward, in the car park, she found Reese loading his bag into the back of a battered Volkswagen. The evening was cool, and the fields beyond the car park were beginning to go dark. She said, "How many gatherings have you attended?" He counted on his fingers, lips moving slightly. 41, 42 including today. "And you write everything down?" "Everything I can. My handwriting's getting faster." He paused. "I've been transcribing the exercise books from the early ones, the ones from year 1 and 2, before anyone had worked out a proper system. Organizing them, cross-referencing where the same information comes up in different places." He said it matter-of-factly, like it was an obvious thing to do, like it had not occurred to him that this was remarkable. Mara looked at him for a moment. He had the slightly haunted look of someone who was carrying something heavier than he let on, which was a look she recognized because she saw it in her mirror every morning. She said, "Are you ready to start running one?" He looked back at her. "Yeah," he said. "I've been ready for a while." She gave him the contact chain for 3 veterans in the Glasgow area who had been waiting for someone young enough to reach the demographic that the original gatherings consistently failed to reach. He wrote the names down in his exercise book, closed it, and put it in his jacket pocket with the economy of movement of someone for whom this action was entirely ordinary. He drove away into the darkening evening, and Mara stood in the car park and watched his taillights disappear and thought, "Good, that's one more, and we are going to need every single one." The compact's relationship with Earth shifted in the 11th year. Not dramatically. There was no single event, no policy announcement that clarified the shift. It was a gradual thing, like a barometric change, and Mara noticed it because she had been watching the compact's administrative structures very carefully for 11 years, and she knew how to read the small signs. New compact ships in low orbit described officially as survey platforms, a quiet restructuring of the Reconciliation Bureau, the replacement of Vekrath 7 with a new planetary administrator named Keth Eras, whose background was not in cultural integration but in compact security operations. Keth Eras had managed the later stages of integration on 2 previous worlds. Mara obtained, through a contact in the compact's civilian administrative apparatus, who was sympathetic enough to be careless about what she left within reach, a summary of the integration histories for those worlds. She read them carefully, and she found, in the pattern of events, a particular shape she had been afraid of seeing. Both worlds had had a period, roughly 12 to 15 years after the initial accord, when the integration appeared to be proceeding smoothly. And then something had changed. The compact had sent someone like Keth Eras, and then the integration had been, in the compact's bureaucratic language, completed. Mara sat in her kitchen in Manchester with her journal open in front of her, and she wrote, "They have decided something. I don't know yet what they've decided, but the shape of the decision is visible in what they are preparing for." She rang Thomas Atchison. He picked up on the first ring, which was unusual for him. He generally let it ring twice, a habit left over from some professional context she had never asked about. The fact that he picked up immediately told her something. "You've seen it too," she said. "Been thinking about it for about 3 months," he said. "The orbital survey platforms aren't survey platforms. The emission signatures are wrong." "How wrong?" "Wrong enough. I had 2 people who used to work signals intelligence run the numbers independently. They agree. Those are tactical observation platforms. He paused. Not weapons. Not yet. But the kind of thing you put in orbit before you need to know where things are on the ground. Mara absorbed this. Outside her window, the Manchester street was gray and ordinary. Children coming home from school. Someone getting groceries out of a car. The ordinariness of it was, as always, both comforting and disorienting, the way the world kept being ordinary around the edges of the thing that was very far from ordinary. We need to count, she said. I know. All of it, everyone. I need to know what we actually have. The counting took 2 months. It was the most dangerous thing the network had ever done, because counting required communication, and communication created signals, and signals could be detected. They did it in person wherever possible, through the chains of personal connection that the archive had spent 11 years building, and where they couldn't do it in person, they used methods Mara described to Akasan as archaeologically invisible. The kind of communication that looks, to anyone analyzing it afterward, like background noise. Callum Reese drove 12,000 miles in those 2 months. He had, since Mara had set him up with the Glasgow contacts 3 years earlier, built a network of gatherings across the north of England and central Scotland that was, in terms of reach and organizational quality, among the best in the whole constellation. He had also developed, in ways Mara found quietly astonishing, a gift for identifying people. The right people. The ones who would show up, who would listen, who would carry it forward and teach it, and not flinch at the necessary severity of what was being asked of them. He had found in that work an unlikely partner in a retired explosives ordnance officer named Ruth Benegas, who had been running her own unauthorized gathering in Middlesbrough for 2 years before anyone in the network knew she existed, and who had, upon being introduced to the broader network, immediately identified 17 organizational improvements that Mara accepted and implemented, with requiring much persuasion. When the count came in, Mara sat at her kitchen table for a long time. 47 gatherings, across what remained of England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and parts of Northern Europe. 461 people who had served. 1,219 who, like Callum Reese, had never served but had spent years absorbing everything the servers could give them. 17 people, scattered across 8 cities, some known to each other, some not, who had independently started teaching formally and systematically, the way General Adeyemi had taught in the barn in Shropshire, with whiteboards and diagrams and the particular precision of people who understood what was at stake. It was not an army. It was nowhere close to an army. An army had equipment and logistics and command structures and supply chains and weapons. What they had was knowledge, stored in almost 2,000 human nervous systems, passed forward through stories and notes and barn-room lectures over 11 years. But knowledge, Mara thought, was the thing that made armies possible. She thought about that for a while, sitting at her kitchen table with the count in front of her, and then she did something she very rarely allowed herself. She let herself feel how far they had come from 31 people in a church hall in Coventry. Then she put that feeling away because there wasn't time for it yet, and picked up the phone and called General Adeyemi. "I have the numbers," she said. There was a silence on the other end of the line that Mara had learned to read over the years they had worked together. The silence of a man doing a private calculation between what was available and what was needed, and deciding how much space to leave between those two things. "Right," he said finally. "Then we have work to do." The Compact's announcement came on a Tuesday in March, in the 14th year of the Accord. Keth Aris delivered it in a broadcast that went out across all Compact communication infrastructure simultaneously. The language was the same compassionate administrative language the Accord had always used. It described a transition to a new phase of Earth's integration. It described certain elements of human culture that had been under extended review. And then it described the next phase of the compassionate discontinuation program, which would address not just the institutional memory of human warfare, but in the Compact's language, the persistent and destabilizing informal transmission of martial cultural artifacts through unlicensed gathering activities. They had been watching the gatherings, not closely enough to understand what the gatherings were, but closely enough to know they existed, closely enough to know they had been proliferating, closely enough to conclude that they needed to stop. Mara watched the broadcast on her laptop in her kitchen. She had a mug of tea that went cold while Keth Aris spoke. When it was over, she sat for a moment with the cold mug in her hands, and she let herself sit with the full weight of what had just happened. It was frightening. She had known it was coming, had been preparing for it for 3 years, and it was still frightening in the way that a thing you have anticipated and a thing arriving are always different in quality. The compact had resources she couldn't fully estimate and organizational capacity that had successfully pacified 6 species and a new planetary administrator who had come up through security operations. The network she had spent 11 years building was real and remarkable, but it was not, by any military standard she could name, a serious fighting force. It was a community of people who had kept something alive in the dark, and the dark was about to get much lighter in all the wrong ways. She drank the cold tea. Then she opened her laptop and typed a single message that went out through the network's oldest and most trusted channels. Coventry, 3 weeks. They came from everywhere. This was the thing Mara had not been able to fully anticipate. The weight of it, the sheer human weight of people who had been waiting and who now moved. She had counted almost 2,000 people in the formal network. What she had not counted, could not have counted, was how many people beyond the formal network had been touched by it, how many quiet conversations over kitchen tables and in pub gardens and on long walks through the kinds of countryside that encouraged honest talk had seeded something that existed independently of the gatherings. How many people who had never attended a single gathering had heard about them and absorbed what they heard and held it. They filled the community center in Coventry. The church hall that had started everything was far too small, and they filled the overflow space in the car park and the street outside. Someone had brought a PA system and rigged speakers with a cable run out through the fire door. Mara counted heads until the counting became impossible. There were more than 4,000 people. General Adeyemi stood at the front of the community center with his hands clasped behind his back, and he looked out at the room, and Mara, standing to his left, watched him take that in. The old general's face was not a face that showed things easily. Decades of command had produced in him a particular quality of composed stillness. But she saw something move through it, brief and complex, and she thought, even he didn't know it was this. Even after all these years, even with everything he knew about what the network had built, he didn't know it was this. He said, in a voice that carried, "I'm not going to pretend we're ready for what's coming. We're not ready. We were never going to be ready because ready was never on offer." He paused. "What we have is what we always had. We have what we kept. We have what we refused to let go of." He looked around the room. "I want to hear from the people who kept it. I want everyone who has been teaching formally, systematically, to stand up." Mara stood up. Atchison in the 3rd row stood up. Callum Reese stood up. Ruth Benegas stood up. And then, around the room, others stood. People she recognized from the network, people she did not recognize, people who had been running their own quiet operations in their own corners of the country and beyond, teaching because teaching was what you did with knowledge that needed to survive. 34 teachers, said one of Adeyemi's aides quietly, in her ear. 34 people who had been running their own gatherings, quietly, in barns and back rooms and fishing clubs and community halls and village schools and rented function rooms, teaching everything they knew or had learned to everyone who would sit still long enough to listen. "Good," said Adeyemi. He was quiet for a moment, and his eyes moved across the people who were still standing. "Then we start." What followed was 16 days that Mara would later describe as the most exhausting and most alive of her life. The community center in Coventry became something that had no official name. She thought of it privately as the academy, though that felt too grand for what it was. A building that smelled of industrial cleaning fluid and people, where 34 teachers rotated through rooms every 4 hours and every room was full, and the exercise books multiplied and the walls filled up, with diagrams that were taken down and redrawn and refined, and the chalk dust accumulated, and nobody swept it up because nobody had time to sweep anything up. The days ran together. There was a timetable, managed by Adeyemi's aide with the quiet efficiency of someone used to keeping complex things from colliding. But the timetable was always under pressure because there was more to teach than there was time, and the people being taught were voracious. Mara had spent years watching people attend gatherings, and she had calibrated a sense for the difference between people who were there out of a diffuse solidarity and people who were there because they understood specifically what was at stake. And this room, for 16 days, was full almost entirely of the second kind. She slept in 4-hour intervals on a folding cot she had brought from her car. She ate sandwiches that appeared at her elbow at irregular intervals, brought by a succession of people she mostly couldn't identify because she was almost always in the middle of something when the food arrived. She drank too much coffee, and she gave, over the course of those 16 days, a version of her lecture on Veilthari institutional thinking to 6 different groups, totaling nearly 300 people. The lecture was the most important thing she did, and she gave it every time with the focused urgency of someone who has been waiting 11 years to say something and has finally been given the time. "I'm going to tell you everything I know about how the Veilthari think," she said, each time, to each group. Not what they're doing, how they think, because that's where we win. And then she talked about the gaps. The Veilthari Compact was an extremely competent institution. This was important to understand, she told them, because it was easy to fall into the error of underestimating it, and an underestimated adversary was an adversary you were already losing to. The Compact had pacified 6 species. It had done so efficiently, humanely by its own standards, and with a cultural logic that was internally consistent, and even, in certain lights, defensible. It genuinely believed it was building toward a more stable galactic order. It had a doctrine of integration that had been developed, refined, and stress-tested across multiple planetary contexts. It was not making things up as it went. The gaps in it were architectural, not accidental. The first gap was categorical thinking. The Compact organized its understanding of resistance into discrete categories and developed doctrine to address each category. This was effective against categorical threats, but it left the Compact vulnerable to threats that did not fit any existing category, which was precisely what the archive had been designed to be. The second gap was scale. The Compact was, at its operational level, an institution optimized for managing large-scale social phenomena. It was very good at addressing things that were big enough to be visible. It was less good at addressing things that were distributed and small, that operated at the level of individual conversations and personal trust, relationships that had no central location and no hierarchical structure, and therefore no single point of failure. The third gap was the deepest and the most important, and it was the one that Mara had spent the most time thinking about. The Compact had pacified 6 species that had each in its own way organized their resistance around institutions. Institutions had addresses. Institutions had leadership. Institutions had formal membership and formal goals and formal records. The Compact was very good at dismantling institutions because the Compact was itself an institution, and it understood how institutions worked. What the Compact had not encountered in 6 planetary integrations was a resistance that was organized around a practice rather than an institution, not around a body that did something, but around the doing of the thing itself. The archive was not an organization. It was a behavior. The behavior of people who gathered and taught and listened and wrote things down and passed them forward. You couldn't dismantle a behavior the way you dismantled an organization, because behavior didn't have a headquarters. She said this to every group she talked to, and every group received it with the slightly intensified attention of people hearing something that made a previous confusion become clear. Callum Reese, in the 4th group she addressed, said, "So the thing we've been doing for 11 years wasn't just how we had to work, it was the right way to work." "Yes," Mara said, "exactly that." The Compact's security operations began in the 16th week after the announcement. They came in the form Mara had anticipated, systematic and organized, targeting the locations her network had identified as Compact priority assessment sites. They were efficient. They swept the formal meeting places, the community halls, the venues that had been used for gatherings, that the Compact's monitors had logged. They found, in most of these places, very little of what they were looking for. Because in the 3 months since the announcement, Mara's people had moved everything, not into new locations, into themselves. This was the thing she had been trying to explain, in various ways, for 11 years. And she had finally found the words for it in the community center in Coventry, standing in front of 4,000 people on the 2nd day. There is no archive for them to seize. The archive is distributed across every person in this room and every person they've taught and every person those people will teach. You can't file it away under Article 19 because it doesn't exist in any form that has an address. Callum Reese had written that down. He had also, she later learned, recited it verbatim to the 3 different groups he ran in the weeks after Coventry, which meant it had entered the vocabulary of at least 60 people. The Compact security forces swept for 3 weeks and found some exercise books and some diagrams, and, in one property in Sheffield, what appeared to be a complete hand-drawn set of topographic maps of the Peak District annotated, with defensive position assessments. These were seized and logged and analyzed, and the compact's assessment was that they represented the work of a small isolated cell of enthusiasts, not a coordinated network. This was the wrong conclusion, but it was the conclusion that followed inevitably from the categorical gap. If you are not looking for a distributed practice, you will find isolated cells. Catharis issued a new directive, broader sweeps, travel restrictions, checkpoints on the roads connecting the cities where elevated levels of unlicensed gathering activity had been detected. The network had anticipated checkpoints. Thomas Acheson had taught, over 11 years of gatherings, everything he knew about the planning and execution of covert movement. He had spent 20 years flying aircraft that occasionally needed to get from one place to another without being detected, and he had spent another 5 years teaching people how that was done, and the knowledge was available, carefully transcribed, in the heads of many people in the network who had sat in the fishing club in Leith and listened and written things down. The network moved through the gaps. It moved slowly, and not without casualties. Several people were detained at checkpoints, held for questioning, released when the compact could not establish a clear violation of the Accord's specific provisions, because the Accord's provisions addressed the possession of military materials and not the possession of knowledge. The law had been written by people who thought of knowledge as something that lived in documents and databases, because that was where knowledge had always been stored by the time any institution tried to regulate it. It had not been written by people who had spent 11 years specifically ensuring that knowledge lived somewhere else. Mara was in a farmhouse in Herefordshire when the compact found the community center records. She had been expecting it. The records were incomplete. She had spent a week after the mass gathering cleaning the community center's booking systems, but not empty enough to be innocent. The compact's analysts would establish that something significant had happened there. What they would not be able to establish it was what it had produced. She was sitting at a kitchen table with Callum Rees and a woman named Yael Dror, who had been an intelligence analyst for Israeli military intelligence before the Accord, and who had been running one of the most technically sophisticated nodes in the archive for 8 years. Yael had a calm precision to everything she did that Mara found steadying in the specific way that certain people who were very good at their work were steadying, not reassuring, exactly, but grounding. When Yael spoke, she was almost always correct, and she never softened a correct assessment to make it easier to receive. She said, "They'll move to containment next. They'll try to close the geographic space, cut communications, restrict movement, identify and isolate what they've designated as the leadership nodes." "Which means us," said Rees, "among others. But they're going to be looking for a hierarchy they can decapitate." A pause. "The advantage we have is that there isn't one." This had been deliberate from the beginning. The archive had never had a command structure in the conventional sense. What it had was a web of trusted relationships in a distributed practice. General Adeyemi was respected and deferred to, but he was not the head of anything. There was no head. If Adeyemi was detained, the network would lose his knowledge and his experience, and that would be a serious loss. But the network would not collapse. If Mara was detained, the network would lose her institutional knowledge and her understanding of the compact, and that would also be a serious loss, and the network would also not collapse. This was by design, and it was the design she was most proud of. "They're going to escalate," Mara said. "Yes. Kinetic, how long?" Yael processed this with her usual economy of movement. "Based on their operational tempo and standard compact escalation doctrine, weeks, perhaps a month. They don't move to direct force quickly, but they will move to it." "Then we need to move faster," Mara said. She looked at Rees. He was already opening his notebook. The compact's final escalation began on a Wednesday. Mara was in the barn in Shropshire, the same barn where General Adeyemi had drawn on a whiteboard 7 years earlier, still smelling of hay and old timber, the whiteboard still faintly marked where it had never quite been wiped clean, when the signals came through the network's personal chains. Compact security forces had begun operations in Manchester, Edinburgh, Cardiff, Dublin, and 8 other cities simultaneously. The people being detained were the ones whose names had appeared on the community center's booking records and on the few other official documents the compact had seized. They were not the right people. The right people had been absent from official records for years. But it was still bad. People were being taken. Families were frightened. And the compact was moving with the intent that Mara had spent 11 years preparing for. She sat in the barn and she thought, with absolute clarity, this is the moment. Not the moment she had hoped for, not a moment of readiness. Just the moment, the one that arrived, as moments did, not when you were ready but when the situation was. The thing they had built, all those years, had to become what it was always supposed to be. Not because they were ready, because the alternative was watching it all be taken anyway. She called Adeyemi. He picked up on the second ring. It's time, she said. I know, he said. Are we ready? The pause, the calculation. No, he said. But we're going. She hung up the phone and stood in the barn for a moment, in the smell of hay and old timber and the faint ghost of chalk dust. And then she made the next call. And the next, and the network began to move with the particular energy of something that has been coiling for a long time and has finally been released. The coordinated response began 48 hours later, and it was not what anyone watching would have expected a military action to look like. There were no weapons being deployed, no formations being assembled. What happened was, in the most literal sense possible, more of what the network had always done. People told each other things, and then they moved to where they needed to be. Callum Rees drove through the night from Herefordshire to a rendezvous point outside Birmingham, where 12 people he had taught or been taught by were waiting. Between them they held, in their combined memory, a detailed plan for the disruption of compact communications infrastructure across the West Midlands. The plan had never been written down. It existed in the minds of the people who had developed it through 2 years of careful technical analysis and passed it forward through every gathering that touched communications technology. Thomas Atkinson flew a small civilian aircraft to a field outside Inverness, where 23 people were waiting in the cold dark. And from that field he coordinated, through hand signals and radio codes developed over years of gatherings in the fishing club in Leith, the most complex simultaneous operation the Scottish nodes had ever attempted. Ruth Benegas organized 46 people in the northeast of England with the same quiet competence she had brought to everything in the 4 years. Mara had known her, working from memory, issuing instructions that had been rehearsed in various forms at gatherings over 3 years, and that therefore required no explanation and very few words. And General Adeyemi walked into the Compact's regional administrative headquarters in London and asked for an appointment with Catharas. They gave him one. He was a former general. The Compact still maintained formal courtesies with public figures. They did not understand that the courtesy was the operation. The meeting between General Adeyemi and Catharas lasted 3 hours, and Mara was not present for it. She was in the back of a van outside the Compact's main communications relay station in Milton Keynes, listening on an earpiece as Rees's team worked through their operation. But she had written the brief that Adeyemi carried. She had spent 3 sleepless nights writing it, and she thought it was the most important thing she had ever written. It was not a set of demands. It was a demonstration. It showed in precise and well-sourced detail what the archive had built. Not the network's tactical capabilities, not yet, but the intellectual and organizational achievement of it, the number of gatherings over 16 years, the number of teachers, the volume of knowledge preserved and transmitted through strictly personal channels across the full duration of the Accord's supposed period of compliance. It showed this the way a scholar shows a theorem. Here is what exists. Here is how it came to exist. Here is why it exists in a form that cannot be undone by the mechanisms you currently have available. It did not threaten. It asked a question. What is the Compact's definition of a destabilizing cultural artifact? Is it the existence of martial knowledge in human minds? Or is it the use of that knowledge in ways that violate the peace? Because if the definition was the former, the Compact had already lost. The knowledge was distributed across 2,000 people, and there was no provision of Article 19 that applied to the interior of a human skull. But if the definition was the latter, then there was a negotiation to be had. Because the network had spent 16 years building and preserving and teaching with the specific discipline of people who understood the difference between capability and intent. Mara had also ensured before the meeting that Catharas would be aware that the disruptions currently running at low intensity across 9 cities would escalate if Adeyemi was detained. This was not a threat in the brief itself. The brief was careful and scholarly and did not threaten. It was communicated through other channels, in the compressed and careful language the network had learned to use, when it needed a message received without a record created. The meeting room was not sealed. Ketharis took 12 days to respond. Mara spent those 12 days in the way she had spent many of the past 16 years, in motion, sleeping in fragments, eating when food was placed near her, monitoring channels, thinking. The controlled tension of those 12 days was qualitatively different from the controlled tension of the preceding years. Before, the threat had been potential. Now it had arrived, and she was living in the space between what she had built and whether it would be enough. And that space was not comfortable, but she had been in uncomfortable spaces before. She thought about Gerald Price, 79 now, if he was still alive, and she believed he was, driving 4 hours in the rain. She thought about Thomas Acheson tapping his temple and saying, "It's still here." She thought about Callum Reese writing without looking at the page, hand moving fast, eyes fixed on what he needed to remember. She thought about what it meant to store things in people. The archive had always been about more than tactics and doctrine. It was about the texture of human experience under difficult conditions, the knowledge of how humans fought and how they endured and how they found, in the middle of terrible things, the small human gestures that made terrible things survivable, the flask passed around, the joke at the worst moment, the particular stubbornness of people who refused to consider themselves beaten until something actually killed them, and sometimes not even then. That wasn't just military knowledge. That was the record of what humans were. You couldn't file that away under Article 19. You couldn't classify it as a destabilizing cultural artifact and put it in an archive and declare it managed. It was not separate from the people. It was the people. Ketharis's response came in the 14th year and 231st day of the Accord. It acknowledged the existence of the archive. It acknowledged, and Mara read this sentence 4 times, that the archive represented a significant and unanticipated development in human response to the pacification framework. It described this carefully as evidence of an adaptive capacity that the Compact's standard models had not accounted for, and it proposed talks, not the immediate reversal of Article 19. The Compact did not reverse things completely. It amended them, graduated them, created subclauses. But the substance of what was proposed was clear, a formal process, within the Compact's institutional structures, to reconsider the Compassionate Discontinuation Program's application to human martial culture, with the archive's core network participating as recognized cultural interlocutors. Mara sat with it for a long time. Then she wrote in her journal, "They thought they were archiving us. They were. We were archiving ourselves." She looked at the sentence for a while. Then she picked up the phone and called Adeyemi. "It came," she said. "I know," he said. "I've read it. What do you think?" He considered for a moment. "I think it's the beginning of something that will take a very long time and be very hard." "Yes. I also think," he said, "that we've been doing very hard things that take a very long time since Coventry. So perhaps we're suited to it." She laughed. It surprised her. She hadn't expected to laugh, hadn't been sure she remembered how to do it with that particular uncomplicated quality. Adeyemi never joked. He said true things that happened to be funny, which was different. "We'll hold another gathering first," she said. "Of course," he said. Where it started." The last remembrance gathering before the formal talks was held in the church hall in Coventry. They had to rent extra chairs from the parish across the street. The hall held 300 people with difficulty, and there were more than 500 who showed up. So the doors were propped open, and the overflow stood in the entrance and the car park and along the street outside. Someone had brought a portable speaker and run a cable through the fire door so the people outside could hear. Gerald Price was there, 79 years old, walking with a stick, driving his own car. He had driven 4 hours from Edinburgh in the rain, as he had driven for 16 years, to every gathering he could reach. He sat in the second row, and he had the same hands Mara remembered from the first night, the unhurried hands of someone who had done difficult things and not forgotten, except that now they rested more carefully on his knees, the way old hands did when they had learned patience. There was no agenda. Mara had insisted on this. No speakers list, no formal proceedings, just what it had always been. Gerald Price stood up and said, "I'll start." His voice did not shake at all. It had not shaken in a long time. "I served in the 4th Armored Brigade. I'd like to tell you about the Battle of the Otranto Strait." The room was completely silent. He talked for 40 minutes. He talked about terrain and weather and the quality of light over the Adriatic on a winter morning and the weight of a decision made under pressure. and the room held its breath around him. The people in the car park and the street outside listened through the howling speaker cable to the specific, particular, irreplaceable knowledge of a man who had been there and had refused to let the memory be bureaucratically erased. After Gerald Price, a woman named Singh, Mara didn't know her, a new face, someone who had come through one of the Reese network nodes in the north, stood up and talked about field engineering under contested conditions. After Singh, a very old man whose name no one in Mara's section of the room seemed to know talked about the Cold War, about the specific Cold War knowledge that had almost been lost even before the Accord, because the people who held it were getting old and the institutional structures that had preserved it had been dismantled by ordinary peacetime bureaucracy long before the compact arrived. He had been writing things down since the 1990s. He had several notebooks. This was the thing, Mara thought, that the compact had consistently failed to understand. The archive was not a response to the compact. The archive was a response to mortality and the passage of time, and the way institutions dissolved and took their knowledge with them, and the way humans stubbornly, in the face of all of this, refused to let the knowledge go. The compact had accelerated it and given it urgency and purpose, but the impulse behind it was as old as the first person who told a younger person something they needed to know to survive. You couldn't regulate that away. It was what humans did with things they loved. Thomas Atchison appeared at Mara's elbow near the end of the evening. She hadn't seen him arrive. He always had that quality, and stood beside her without speaking for a while, listening to a retired naval officer describe the geometry of convoy protection in a way that made the abstract mathematics of it suddenly visible as something physical and human and real. Then Atchison said quietly, we kept it, Mara said. All those years. They were quiet for a moment, both listening. The naval officer was using his hands to show the shape of something, the arc of approach and response, and several people in the front row were sketching in their notebooks. Do you know what I thought about? Atchison said. In the first years, when it was 12 people in a fishing club in Leith, and I wasn't certain anyone outside that room was doing the same thing? Tell me. I thought about the Blitz. He said it simply, without drama, the way he said most things, not the fighting. The other thing, the way people in London in 1940 just didn't stop being themselves. Everything was under threat. The whole fabric of the thing, the ordinary life, the ordinary expectations. And people kept going to the pub. They kept up their routines. They made jokes in the shelters. They looked after each other's kids. He paused. I thought, the thing that wins is not the thing that fights best. It's the thing that refuses to stop being itself. Mara considered this. Outside, through the propped open door, she could hear the street. The quiet sounds of people who had driven long distances to stand on a pavement outside a church hall and listen to things being remembered. That's exactly what we did, she said. Stubborn lot humans, said Atchison. It was not entirely a compliment, but there was something in it, in the dryness of it, the worn affection, that was worth more than a compliment. The most stubborn lot in the galaxy, Mara, as far as we know. As far as we know, he agreed. Inside, Gerald Price had finished. Someone else was standing up. The exercise books were open. The knowledge was moving, the way it had always moved, from one person to the next, stubborn and warm and specifically, irreducibly human, in the only archive that had ever really mattered. Mara stood at the back of the church hall in Coventry and listened to it happen, and outside the spring evening deepened, and the streetlights came on one by one, and somewhere down the road, a child was shouting something in the specific gleeful way of children, released from something into something better, persistent and joyful and entirely refusing to come inside. The formal talks began 6 weeks later. Mara led the delegation. She was 53 years old, and she had spent 16 years building something she had been told was impossible. And she was tired in the specific way of people who have been doing important things for a long time without stopping. She prepared for the talks by writing down everything she knew, everything she needed to understand better, and everything she was afraid of. The fear section was longest. She read it through and kept it, because the fears she could name were the fears she could work with. The talks were hard. The compact's institutional logic resisted modification at the scale required. Keth Aris was not an enemy, but was also not an ally. There were sessions that ended with nothing, and sessions that appeared to progress in sessions, where Mara drove back to her rented flat with the tiredness that came from spending 8 hours being precise about things that mattered enormously, and having to be precise about them again the next morning. But the talks did not collapse. In the 7th month, the compact agreed to recognize the preservation and transmission of human martial knowledge as a cultural practice rather than a destabilization risk. It was the argument Mara had been making in various forms for a decade and a half. That culture and capability were not the same thing. That knowledge did not imply intent. That what the network had demonstrated was not preparation for violence, but refusal to be stripped of identity. In the 9th month, the first officially sanctioned forum was held in Birmingham. A compact cultural observer sat in the back row and took notes. The notes, Mara was told, were largely favorable. In the 11th month, the talks paused for a review period, and Mara went home to Manchester. She stood in her kitchen and made tea and stood at the window and watched the street below. An ordinary street. Children coming home. Someone getting groceries from a car. The ordinariness of it was both comforting and disorienting in the way it had always been, the way the world kept being ordinary around the edges of the extraordinary. She thought about the morning after the first gathering in Coventry, driving home through the wet streets, 31 people in folding chairs, 3 exercise books. She thought about how improbable it had seemed, and how improbable it had remained right up until it wasn't, right up until the moment 4,000 people showed up in a community center, and an old general said, "We have what we kept." And nobody doubted him. She sat down at her kitchen table with her tea and her journal, and she wrote the last entry she would make about the archive as a thing under threat. "We built the archive out of people, and people, it turns out, are very hard to file." She closed the journal. She drank the tea while it was still hot. Outside in the street, children were making noise, and the afternoon light was doing something complicated with the clouds over the terrace rooftops. And somewhere down the block someone was laughing, full-throated and unguarded, the laugh of a person who had decided that whatever came next, they were going to meet it with their whole self intact. Mara listened to that laugh for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she opened her laptop and got back to work. In the months between the Coventry gathering and the compact's escalation, the network did something it had never done before. It practiced, not drilling. Not in any sense that would have been recognizable to the military observers who, under Article 19, had been certified as decommissioned and were therefore no longer observing anything. What happened in those months was more like the final refinement of a craft. The thing that happens when people who have been learning have finally learned enough that they can begin to understand what learning for learning's sake could not teach them. Application, in other words. The understanding that there was a distance between knowing something and being able to do it under conditions of real pressure, and that distance had to be closed. Callum Rees organized the first of what the Northern Nodes came to call exercises, though they called them that only internally and never in writing. He ran them out of the same kinds of spaces the gatherings had always used: barns and community halls and, in one memorable case, the lower level of a multi-story car park in Leeds that had been partially repurposed as storage, space and whose owner, a retired logistics officer who attended Rees's gatherings, made available for 3 evenings in a row in exchange for nothing except the continued existence of the network that was his only community. The exercises were not combat simulations. They were logistics problems and communications problems, and the specific class of problem that Mara had been most insistent about: decision-making under conditions of incomplete information and time pressure. This last category was Yael Dror's contribution. Yael had spent 8 years teaching intelligence analysis, and her particular insight, which she had articulated to Mara in the farmhouse in Herefordshire, in terms that Mara had immediately recognized as exactly right, was that the gap between knowing what to do and doing it correctly under pressure was primarily an information problem. You trained your way into the knowledge. You exercised your way into the decision-making. The exercises produced unexpected results. The most unexpected was the emergence of what Rees came to call the second generation. These were people, many of them young, many of them people who had grown up entirely under the Accord and who had no memory of the world before it, who had been attending gatherings for years and absorbing everything available, and who turned out, when placed under the conditions of an exercise, to have internalized something that went beyond the content of what they had been taught. They had internalized the logic of it. They understood, instinctively, how the pieces fit together, how the information in one exercise book related to the information in another, How the tactical principles General Adeyemi drew on whiteboards connected to the technical knowledge Thomas Atkinson had recorded in his 240 pages of syllabus. They're not repeating what they've been told, Reese told Mara over the phone after the fourth exercise. They're applying it. They're making connections I didn't make for them. That's what teaching is supposed to produce, Mara said. I know. I didn't expect it to look like this. He paused. There's a girl in the Leeds group, 22 years old. She was 12 when the accord was signed. She has never held a weapon in her life. She came up with a communications relay scheme in the exercise that 3 people with combined operational experience of 60 years hadn't thought. Mara was quiet for a moment. Get me her details, she said. I want to meet her. The girl's name was Fatima Saleh. She was 22, had grown up in Huddersfield, had first come to a gathering at the age of 16 because her father had attended them and brought her when her mother was ill and there was no one to look after her. She had been supposed to wait in the car. She had not waited in the car. She had attended 59 gatherings since then, which was more than anyone except Callum Reese. She had, apparently, spent a significant portion of those 6 years thinking rather than writing. And when Mara met her, she understood immediately. Fatima Saleh had the kind of mind that did not require notes because everything it processed was immediately integrated and cross-referenced against. Everything it already knew, and what it produced was not recollection but synthesis. Why the relay scheme? Mara asked her, when they met in a cafe in Leeds on a grey Tuesday. Walk me through how you got there. Fatima walked her through it. She referenced, without prompting, a technical detail from Atchison's syllabus, a communications principle from a gathering she had attended 3 years earlier at which a former signals officer had talked about redundancy in field communications, and a Veilthari administrative document that Mara had circulated through the network 18 months ago, and that she had not expected anyone other than intelligence professionals to retain in useful detail. How did you remember the Veilthari document? Mara asked. Fatima looked slightly puzzled. I write about everything in a journal. I've been writing about it since I was 16. When I see something that connects to something I've written before, I can feel the connection before I can articulate it. Mara looked at her across the table. How many journals? 11 so far. A pause. I keep them in different places, Mara thought. We have spent 16 years storing things in people, and the people have been building their own systems for doing this, systems we didn't design and didn't anticipate, because this is what humans do. They adapt the storage medium. She thought about writing that in her own journal, and then she thought, I don't need to. I know it now in a way that doesn't need writing down. In the months before the compact's escalation, Mara also spent a significant amount of time on a problem she had never fully solved and that had been living at the back of her mind since the earliest days of the archive. The question of what they were for. The archive had been built in response to a threat. The immediate purpose was preservation, keeping the knowledge alive against the compact's attempt to extinguish it. The secondary purpose, which had become more explicit as the years passed and the network grew, was capability, ensuring that if the compact moved to a more aggressive phase of integration, humans would not be completely helpless. But purpose at that level of abstraction was insufficient for the practical decisions the network had to make. And in the 16th week after the compact's announcement, when Mara was coordinating the network's response across 9 cities and managing an operation the scale of which the archive had never before attempted, she found that the insufficient articulation of purpose was a real operational problem. Some people in the network wanted to fight, not defensively, they wanted to move aggressively against compact administrative infrastructure, to demonstrate that the cost of completing the integration was higher than the compact had calculated. There was a coherent argument for this. The compact made decisions based on institutional cost-benefit analysis, and a sufficiently high demonstration of resistance cost might produce a recalculation. Some people in the network, most of the ones with professional intelligence backgrounds, and notably Yale Dror, argued for a different posture. Demonstrate capability without deploying it, and use the demonstration as leverage in a negotiation the compact could not avoid once it understood what it was facing. This was Mara's brief. This was the argument the brief made. And some people, a smaller number but not negligible, and including some of the network's most experienced veterans, argued that the whole exercise was already lost. that the compact would not negotiate from a position of demonstrated competence, but would simply escalate its response until the resistance was eliminated, and that the right posture was not negotiation but dispersal and survival. The disagreement was real, and Mara did not dismiss any of the positions. She had spent 11 years building a network on the understanding that different people brought different frames to the same problem, and that the network was stronger for containing that plurality, and she was not going to resolve the disagreement by declaring one frame correct and the others naive. What she did instead was the thing she had always done. She laid out the analysis as precisely as she could. She shared it with everyone who needed to see it, and she made the best decision available with the information she had. The brief was the right call. She believed that. She had done the Veilthari institutional analysis. She understood how the compact's decision-making worked, and she believed that a demonstration of organized and sophisticated resistance capability, accompanied by a credible invitation to negotiation, was the response that maximized the probability of an outcome other than annihilation. She also held, clearly, the knowledge that she might be wrong, that the compact might not respond the way her analysis predicted, that Ketharis might have a directive that superseded the normal institutional calculus, that all the years of careful building might end in something that could not be negotiated. She held that knowledge, and she went ahead anyway. Because going ahead anyway with the best analysis you had was the only thing you could do. There was a moment, in the third day after Adeyemi walked into the compact's administrative headquarters, when Mara genuinely did not know if it was going to work. She was in a service corridor in the relay station building in Milton Keynes. She had gone inside when Reese's team ran into a technical difficulty with the secondary interface and needed a human presence on the ground. And she was listening to Reese's voice in her earpiece and watching a door at the end of the corridor, and she was thinking, with terrible clarity, that the brief might have been wrong, not about the analysis, about the timing, about whether the demonstration of capability would land as a reason to negotiate, or whether it would land as a provocation that pushed Ketharis toward the harder option. She had run this calculation many times. She had landed on the same conclusion each time, but conclusions had error bars, and standing in a service corridor with your heart beating faster than you preferred, there was a particular quality to error bars that classroom analysis did not fully convey. She thought about Gerald Price. Not strategically, just thought about him. The specific image of him standing up in the church hall in Coventry 16 years ago, in the buzzing fluorescent light, with a voice that was trying not to shake, saying, "I'll start," because someone had to start and he was there. She thought, that is what this is. That is the whole thing. Someone has to start, and then someone has to keep going, and then someone else has to keep going after that. You don't know if it works. You go anyway. That is the only thing that has ever worked. The door at the end of the corridor stayed closed. Reese's voice in her earpiece resolved the technical difficulty with the calm precision of someone who had practiced it enough that pressure had stopped changing anything. The operation continued. The meeting room in London was not sealed. Ketharis was not a character in Mara's story in the way that Adeyemi or Acheson or Callum Reese were. She had never spoken to Ketharis directly. What she knew of the planetary administrator came from documents and from Adeyemi's account of the 3-hour meeting and from the texture of the decisions Ketharis made in the weeks between the meeting and the response. What she concluded from all of this was that Ketharis was an intelligent administrator who had encountered something genuinely outside the parameters of the compact's standard models, and who had chosen to respond to that encounter by enlarging the model rather than trying to force the new data into the old one. This was, Mara thought, the correct response. It was also unusual. Most institutions, faced with data that did not fit their models, tried to fit the data. The institutional incentive was always toward the preservation of the existing framework. Ketharis had instead done something that required a kind of intellectual courage that Mara had not expected, acknowledged that the model was incomplete. She wrote about this in her journal because she thought it was important to understand the compact's capacity for learning if the talks were going to go anywhere. An adversary that couldn't update its model was an adversary you could predict but never negotiate with. An adversary that could update its model was something more complex and more interesting, and ultimately more useful to be in a room with. She wrote, "The compact is wrong about us. It has always been wrong about us. but it is capable of learning that it is wrong, which means we can show it. That is the door. The formal talks would take years. She knew this. The compact's institutional processes were slow and multi-layered and required consensus across levels of the apparatus that were not always aligned with each other. There would be setbacks. There would be sessions that felt like regression. There would be moments when the whole thing felt like it was going to collapse, and then didn't. And moments when it felt like it was making progress and then retreated. None of that was different from what the archive had been doing for 16 years. After the last gathering in Coventry and before the formal talks began, Mara drove north to Edinburgh. She had not been to Edinburgh since the early years, since the fishing club in Leith. She drove the familiar motorway in the grey morning light, with coffee in a thermos and the radio off, and arrived in Leith at the hour when the city was just beginning its working day. Acheson was waiting outside the fishing club. He was in his mid-70s now and moved with the economy of someone whose body had delivered its opinions on the subject and been accommodated, and he had a bag over one shoulder and the look of someone who had been awake for a while. "You didn't have to come up," he said. "I wanted to." They walked along the waterfront. The morning was cold and clear, and the water was the color of old pewter under a sky that hadn't decided yet what kind of day to be. Mara matched Acheson's pace, which was slower than it had been. "How are the talks going to go?" he asked. "Slowly," she said, messily, "with some steps backward for every 2 forward, same as everything else. Same as everything else." They walked in silence for a while. Gulls were making their opinions known overhead. A fishing boat was moving out of the harbor, small against the gray water. "I keep thinking," Acheson said, "about what the compact must have thought when Adeyemi walked in, when they found out what we'd built." He was quiet for a moment. Whether it surprised them. Whether anything surprises them anymore, after doing this 6 times. "I think it did," Mara said. "Not the resistance. They expected some form of resistance. What surprised them was the form it took." She paused. "They've spent 6 integrations watching species either accept pacification or organize visible resistance that they could engage with directly. What they found here was something they didn't have a category for." "A Ramblers Association," said Axon. "A Ramblers Association," she agreed. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was related to one. "We should have called it that officially, on the documents. Next time. God forbid there's a next time," he said, and then, more seriously, "But if there is, we know how to do it now." Mara looked at the water. "That's what the talks are for, partially. To put that knowledge somewhere, it doesn't have to be secret." She thought about this for a moment. The archive kept itself alive by being invisible. Eventually, if the talks go the way I need them to go, the archive gets to stop being invisible, gets to be recognized, gets to be part of what humans are allowed to be formally in front of everyone. "That will be strange," Acheson said. "Yes," said Mara. "I think it will." They stood at the waterfront for a while longer, watching the boat diminish against the water, and then Acheson reached into his bag and produced a thermos of his own and 2 cups. He poured tea, properly made, the way Mara had only rarely managed in 16 years of living out of other people's spaces, and handed her a cup, and she took it with both hands because the morning was cold. "I want to see the fishing club," she said. "It's still there," said Acheson. "They put new chairs in a few years ago. Better ones. The old ones were terrible. The old ones were fine. The old ones were terrible. We just didn't complain because we had other things to think about." She laughed. He smiled into his tea. The gulls argued overhead, and the pewter water moved, and somewhere in the city behind them the day was beginning in earnest. The ordinary machinery of ordinary life turning over and starting up. And Mara stood in the cold morning and held her cup of tea and felt, for the first time in a long time, something she recognized as peace. Not the peace of having won. She hadn't won. She had opened a door that would take years to walk through completely. Not the peace of certainty, because nothing was certain. The peace of having done the thing she set out to do, of having refused to stop, of having built, from 31 people in a church hall, and 3 exercise books, and the stubbornness of a species that stored its knowledge in each other and would not let it be taken, something that had survived everything the compact had tried. She drank her tea. "Come on," said Acheson. "It's too cold to stand here philosophizing. Show me these new chairs." They walked back along the waterfront together, and behind them the morning light came in off the water, and ahead of them the city of Edinburgh went about its unremarkable and essential business, and in thousands of houses and notebooks and skulls across the length and width of the country, the archive endured, stubborn, warm, alive, specifically, irreducibly, impossibly, enduringly human.